Okay, hello and welcome to Avalon Sexual Assault Center's Bringing Down Barriers Sexual Assault Awareness Month Lunch and Learn series. We are so excited to be able to offer this series in collaboration with our community partners to learn about the specific vulnerabilities that communities experience in relation to sexualized and gender-based violence, barriers to accessing services, and ways that we can make changes individually and organizationally to better support the needs of survivors. Avalon Center is located in Chibuktuk, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Acknowledging our presence on this land is particularly important when holding conversations about sexualized and gender-based violence, which have historically been and are currently still today tools of colonization and violence against Indigenous communities across Turtle Island. We invite you to reflect on the land on which you currently reside and to join us in standing in solidarity and action with residential school survivors, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and their families, land and water protectors, and Indigenous people and communities across the country. We are all treaty people and have an active role to play in reconciliation. We also acknowledge the connection between the land and African Nova Scotian communities and stand with survivors of the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children and all forms of institutional abuse and neglect. We recognize the environmental racism present in Nova Scotia and are committed to addressing legacies of racism and white supremacy in our work to end gender-based violence and beyond. April 2021 is the 20th anniversary of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, a time to honor the voices and experiences of survivors and to bring awareness to issues relating to sexualized violence. Everyone has a role to play in ending sexual assault, harassment, and abuse, and we thank you for being present here today to learn with us. Avalon Sexual Assault Center works to eliminate sexualized violence and the social and political culture that fosters violence and oppression through a continuum of community-based prevention and response services. The Youth Project's mission is to make Nova Scotia a safer, healthier, and happier place for 2SLGBTQIA+ youth through support, education, resource expansion, and community development. The Youth Project is a multi-service organization hosting an education team, programming team, and support services worker with an aim to further the inclusion and wellness of 2SLGBTQIA+ youth under the age of 25, to foster knowledge exchange and training, increase access to public services, and provide social and cultural programs, services, and celebrations for 2SLGBTQIA+ youth and their communities. Before we get started, I want to direct you to the Q&A box, which is located in the middle of the taskbar at the bottom of your Zoom window. There will be a time for questions and answers, so please ask away using either the Q&A feature or the chat, which I will be monitoring throughout the webinar. There is also live closed captioning available, which you can turn on by clicking the CC live captioning button, which is also on the bottom of your taskbar in the Zoom window. When the webinar is complete, a survey will pop up that we hope you can take a moment to fill out, which will help us evaluate this webinar series and plan for future events. Thank you in advance for taking the time to fill this out. I also want to acknowledge that discussions about sexualized and gender-based violence can be challenging, especially for survivors in our virtual room. In the chat box, I will be posting a link to a resource with several grounding activities, and I invite you to take care of yourself in this space and afterwards. Without further ado, I am delighted to introduce Carmel, the Executive Director of the Youth Project, who will discuss comprehensive and trauma-informed support for 2SLGBTQIA+ youth survivors of sexualized and gender-based violence. We're so excited and grateful to learn from you today. Carmel, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. I have a little presentation that I'm going to go through with folks, and then there is space for you to engage and ask questions to your interest and comfort. So I'm going to start by, well, Dee actually did an amazing job. So Dee did all of the things. Dee said the pieces that I wanted to say at the beginning, but really the core of today is dreaming transformative futures. A huge part of the incredible and important work of systems change is allowing for there to be places of imagination where youth specifically can challenge the systems that exist and be asked the really important question of what will you do differently? A huge element of redistribution of power and redistribution of the context of the world that we live is allowing young people the space to really identify the needs that they have and critique the systems that are currently in place. And so that is the center of the piece that I want to be talking about today. So Dee did all of these pieces so beautifully. And so I'm not going to say a lot. I just really want to welcome you to the space and also echo the piece around taking care and engaging in the way that feels best to you. So I want to start in a really basic place, just a really basic anti-oppression framework. But I want to apply this directly and specifically to sexual and gender-based violence. So within the institutions that exist in our world, we see the ways in which our legal model, our medical model, our education model are all actively often work against survivor voice and survivor experience. And we see that through various realities. We see that through the construction of an ideal understanding of victimhood that exists through the context of our media, that exists through the context of our legal system, and is enforced through our police system. We see that the ways in which education is prioritized and what is prioritized and what is not. I think it is crucial and imperative that young people have access to learning around interacting with folks who are disclosing. It's really important for young folks to cultivate skills around boundary setting and emotional care for themselves and for their collective communities. And those elements of education need to be prioritized in our school system. So we see the ways in which our institutions are not building necessarily a world that exists to elevate survivor voice and survivor need, and also is potentially and often actively working against folks who have a variety of those experiences. Through that complex context of our institution, we also see through the construction of the perfect or ideal victim, the ways in which that doesn't apply to folks who experience disproportionate levels of violence and also experience disproportionate levels of discrimination through our systems. So we see that the construction of the ideal or perfect victim does not build a lot of space for 2SLGBTQIA+ experience. And we see that in the context of who we understand to experience violence and what kind of context. We understand that through the relationship specifically of racialized folks and our legal systems and our systems of law enforcement. And we also see that in the ways in which media writes about folks who have experienced violence, as well as the ways in which often when media represents sexual or gender-based violence, it is glamorized, it is not authentic to survivor experience, and often folks who've experienced sexualized violence are not directing those stories from their autonomous or self-determining brilliances, right? So we see the ways in which our institutions are existing to create hostile and violent spaces for survivors of sexualized violence. And also on top of that, creating spaces where there aren't as many accessible entry points for growth or for change. And so when looking at our institutions, it's incredibly important to think about what could look different. How can we reimagine the ways in which our systems interact? What needs to be abolished, what needs to be created. And in these twin processes of creation and disintegration, how do we specifically elevate youth voice? And that will be an ongoing theme for me, specifically because of my work at the Youth Project, but also because fundamentally I believe in the inherent magic and brilliance of young people. And I also believe in their ability to dream the futures that we are all most deserving of. So if we think about this anti-oppression framework and we think about our institutions, I want it to think about it like a muscle. So a muscle contracts, and even though our communities exist as brilliant beacons or oases to some of us, We have to acknowledge the ways in which our community dynamics often mirror systems of oppression from our institutions. And that is a really insidious way in which our institutions maintain power over specifically marginalized community. So the ways in which, for example, the idea of victimhood is constructed in relationship to our legal system, which we understand to be transphobic, which we understand to be racist, which we understand to be ableist, our communities sometimes unintentionally respond in similar ways. And because we have not prioritized as a society the ways in which we interact with each other emotionally and support survivors or support our communities or learn collective skills of transformative justice, often then we are mirroring these broken systems within our interpersonal interactions with our community dynamic. And so it's crucial, especially when we're doing community-based organizing, to look at our makeups of our boards, the ways in which our policy looks, and compare it to institutional practice or institutional best practice. If our community organizations are mirroring institutional best practice, we have failed. There is no reason that our community organizations, that our community networks have to mirror institutions that we understand to be broken. We have incredible creativity and brilliance to create and forge new systems of interaction and create a blueprint that works for us in the way that we need it to work. So I truly challenge everyone here today to think about the ways in which our community networks or our community organizations have policy or procedure or best practices that mirror institutions in ways that are damaging and or violent to the most vulnerable populations that we want to be engaging with. And we also want to, of course, forever be deconstructing the power differential and power dynamics that exist at the heart of our communities that mirror these institutional powers. And then, of course, our framework contracts more, and our interpersonal relationships, our interpersonal reactions are, of course, impacted by our sense of community, what our community deems to be good and bad, and of course, what our institutions dictate to be good and bad. And often we're really, really stuck in a binaristic framework of right and wrong or believable or unbelievable. And we need to really push past that to hold an intersectional and trauma-informed analysis that understands that multiple realities exist, that a variety of people might access the exact same program or the exact same system and have a variety of differential experiences and sometimes contradictory experiences, and hold that reality. And then, of course, our sense of self. Our sense of self is deeply impacted by all of these facets of the world around us. And our sense of self then holds how we understand kind of our moral compass or our identity in the face of injustice. So much like this framework exists in a way that contracts, it also can expand. And so the expansion is very exciting to me. The expansion starts from our sense of self, our sense of identity, the way in which we understand the world, our frames of reference, our table of contents, as you will, and then can shift and bleed into the ways in which our interpersonal relationships and interactions exist, and then push our communities to be more aware, more self-critical in a loving way, of course, and then eventually shift our institutional frameworks. It's really crucial in these moments of reflection to know that our institutions are the slowest moving part. What is most important right away is to shift the pieces that we have active autonomy and active control over, which are our understandings, our internalized biases, our self-reflection in the face of a variety of different experiences, the ways in which we engage with each other, the ways in which we cultivate our emotional skills, the way in which we understand our community networks and our community resources, and understand the power networks and the power workings of our inner communities. And then we work to shift our institutions, but it feels often like the work that we do within our communities is often how our institutions then, of course, begin to shift and change. So I really want to offer this as a takeaway exercise. So we don't have time to do it with each other today, but I want to think about this equity and diversity or this anti-oppression framework. And I want you to think about your internalized biases around survivorship. Who do you think that is? What do they look like? What was their experience? Who are they in community with? How are they coping, or how are they navigating their healing process, or how are they accessing supports? Think about all of those pieces those immediate assumptions that you feel are inherent truths to your practice. Sometimes the inherent truths to our practice and our internalized biases are contradictory. We know politically that we have to and must be hypercritical of those potential biases. So our practice may look different than our internalized biases, but it's so crucial to look at our internalized biases and examine them and reflect. It's really important in these moments to think about how those internalized biases insidiously impact the way in which our service provision looks, the way in which we interact with clientele, the way in which we expect folks to tell their stories, and also the ways in which we interact with our staff teams or our community partners or our networks of care. And I think a huge piece to really examine around our internalized biases and around survivorship are to ask yourself, if it's hard to identify within your own practice, who taught you about the work that you are in right now? Who were your mentors? It's often easier to find another person's internalized bias. So think about your mentor, think about your teachers and what they have given you around your learning that is brilliant and incredible and strong that you want to maintain, but also think about the ways in which you potentially inherited or most likely inherited some of their internalized biases that affected their practice or their way of community navigation. So then when you have that reflection happening, think about your interpersonal relationships or interactions that validate these biases. Who do you talk to in your workplaces? Who are your community partners? What experiences do they have? Are they differential experiences? Are there complementary experiences? Are you experiencing folks just validating your ideas? And if so, where is the harm in that? That might be a really supportive network, but where is the harm if we are not holding ourselves to loving and fierce accountability in our community navigation roles or in our community dynamics or in our community organizations? And then what communities do you belong to and how do they validate these biases? What community power or social capital do you hold? So in which ways do you have the power to influence community understanding? That's a really important piece. Our social capital, especially in under-resourced communities, is currency. And so if you have access to that social capital, how are you using it to build space and to build platform to elevate voices that are actively underrepresented in your community networks? And then finally, what institutions reflect your identity, affirm your biases, what institutions protect you, and what institutional power do you have? So this is an interesting piece because often, at least I feel quite disempowered within the context of institution. But it is really important to reflect on that piece around power and re-understand it as safety. And safety is currency as well. If you can access a medical system and feel safe and feel believed and feel understood and feel like you don't have to self-advocate the entire route, that is power in that space. It might not be the kind of power that can shift and change policy immediately, but it is still differential power that some folks may never have access to or may have never experienced in their lifetime. So think about power as safety. And I think something that is really resonating with me is work that has been happening specifically around conversations pertaining to the failure of our policing systems, and specifically seeing folks speak about their experiences as young people interacting with law enforcement, and folks talking about how if you feel as though the police will protect you, that is a privilege. And so when we think about that in relationship to survivorship, that is really resonant, right? Because we don't have a lot of external systems where survivors of sexual or gender-based violence can go to. There aren't safe havens that exist outside of our community networks. And so if our community networks are failing and our bigger institutional powers are not holding folks in safety, then what options do we have? And so I think that in my work, that is where it becomes like a trial and error creativity kind of like imagination project around how can I reimagine my relationship to various community networks so that I can provide a comprehensive and care-based support system for folks that are not necessarily safer, believed, understood by the systems of power at play. So specifically in this context, thinking about our medical system, thinking about our legal system, and thinking about law enforcement and the police. So when we think about intersectionality, a theory coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in '89, also the hashtag Say Her Name creator, which completely revolutionized the way in which folks were discussing and talking about police violence specifically impacting Black women. We see the ways in which all of this is rooted in that brilliant theory. And an important piece is, how do we apply this to survivor and gender justice, gender-based justice? How do we apply the intersectional framework that we believe to be true to networks that may not operate through an intersectional framework? And that's, I'm going to get to like a way that we can build kind of a safety map in a moment, but I'm really interested in the question, how do we build something that is intersectional through systems that don't hold intersectional practice? And I think a huge piece in my learning around that has been a lot of frontline advocacy and a lot of specific education-based work to further understanding within our institutional contexts, but also knowing that that education element doesn't always provide lasting or sustainable change, because these institutions are deeper and more powerful than one of my anti-oppression workshops, right? And so in those moments, it's really important to also work alongside our communities and ask what they need as they navigate hostile experiences within our institutions. Another element is acknowledgement. So acknowledging that the systems may not be what the person needs. It's not to deter a person from accessing a system. In fact, I believe that one of the most important elements in systems navigation work is providing a plethora of options through a non-biased lens and saying, here are all of the options. But I also think it's important when discussing options to discuss the realities in a way that a person then can make their most informed decision. Specifically working with 2SLGBTQIA+ youth, their autonomy is always in question. Unfortunately, we live in a world that doesn't value and understand the power of youth voice in so many different contexts. So when working with survivors of sexual and/or gender-based violence, the most important element to me, or for me, is to provide choice, self-determinism, and autonomy. It is not about my personal politic. It is not about my organizational politic. It is about creating and building a container of safety for this young person to self-determine and to negotiate with themselves and their support networks what works best for them and their journey. It's really crucial, again, when we think about our internalized biases, to also discuss our internalized biases around healing process, around potentially a linear navigation process of support, and really check that in our urges to provide support and understand that support is a consensual process. We don't just help a person, we navigate that alongside them. It's negotiated and it's not compulsory, it's created, right? It's negotiated and navigated. And so it's so critical to also challenge the ableist understanding that we are helpers and people are helpees. It's a context where we have mutuality and relationship building. And that is so crucial when we want to provide a service that is differential from a potentially oppressive service that exists in our world. This is some theory around intersectionality. So if you are interested, you can send me an email and we can give you the slides and you can learn more. So when we think about care-based methodologies holding an intersectional analysis, of course, we're thinking about culturally relevant, harm reductive, and holistic wellness approaches. So that means that when we're asking and discussing with a young person who is part of the 2SLGBTQIA+ community, we acknowledge that there are certain spaces that are maybe transmisogynist. We acknowledge that there are certain spaces that may not hold room for their experiences. Of course, we do that in ways that allow for them to, of course, then make their informed decisions. So we talk about it in a way that is, of course, consent oriented. So often what I do when I'm working with a young person is I provide all the resources. And then I ask the question, are you interested in talking about each resource? What do you want to know? Do you want to know just what you need to do to access it? Do you want to know about previous youth's experiences accessing these resources? What would feel most helpful in determining your decision-making process? So of course, I'm not going to share unless that is welcomed and invited. through that context of creating culturally relevant harm reductive services, it also means that we have to fill the gaps often. And this can be really intense work, especially for folks that are juggling a whole bunch of different elements of their work and their job. But I think that when we create those culturally relevant pieces, specifically around 2SLGBTQIA+ folks, it's having complex conversations around often the understanding of perfect or constructed survivorhood. It's giving that young person space to feel frustrated about how their experiences are not documented or discussed or talked about or taboo. Part of that culturally relevant harm reductive approach is also making sure that folks have access to peer support networks on top of whatever other elements that they're accessing. It's important to acknowledge that a 2S LGBTQIA+ person may not want to go to the police at all. And that is from a long-seated history of mistrust within police services that are extremely valid, and a long history of violence, which is extremely valid that that young person is thinking about their safety. And so it is never, I think, important in those moments to push or to pressure a young person to report, or push or pressure a young person to go through a process that is most understood as the process that you navigate. And then, of course, holistic wellness approaches. This young person may never want to report and may never want to go through a navigation of a legal and or police-based process. So what else exists? And so that is where that creative conversation happens with that young person to ask what they are looking for around supportive spaces. Does peer support feel exciting to them? Does it feel nourishing to them? Are they looking for specifically group support? Are they looking for one-on-one support? Are they looking for just community spaces that they can go and exist and be themselves, and that feels healing to them? What are the pieces that they're looking for? And then it's important, of course, to have a community-based practice so that when a youth asks for something, we can go through that little Rolodex in our brains and say, okay, these are some things that exist. There are gaps. Here are the ways that we can fill those gaps. Or this service doesn't exist at all, but there are some adjacent services that hold some of the pieces that you're looking for. And so creating a patchwork quilt of holistic wellness approaches to hold that young person in a caring and trauma-informed way. Of course, often the intersection of violence is very, very apparent when working with 2S LGBTQIA+ youth. There is the intersection, of course, of queerphobia, transmisogyny, specifically transmisogyny, femphobia, and all of those pieces impact that young person's experience. So while they are experiencing sexual and gender-based violence, they're also potentially experiencing a variety of other oppressive realities linked to that experience that drove that experience or catalyzed that experience. And it's important to acknowledge that, especially if that young person is acknowledging that. So of course, that's where that shift or that difference in experience exists. And as Audre Lorde says much more succinctly and brilliantly than I just did, there is no such thing as single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So how is this young person interacting with their experience, and how are their lived experiences impacting the experience that they are having in the experience in itself, in the acute trauma or the ongoing perpetual trauma, and or in their systems navigation approach. So of course, back to youth leadership models, we understand lived experience as expertise. We understand that the personal is political. So this phrase has deep roots in Black feminist discourse. We see this mapped through history from a Black feminist statement to Audre Lorde's essay, The Master's Tool, and more broadly when Kimberly Crenshaw creates a really brilliant analysis of identity politic in 91. So we see the ways in which this idea, the personal is political, has deep roots in feminist discourse, has deep roots in specifically Black feminist discourse, in queer and trans discourse, because we understand that our experiences give us tools and insight that allow us to hold not only our systems to criticality, but understand that we need to build new things. And that's often why we exist. That's why the Youth Project exists, because there was a need to build something new. So how does this relate? How does youth leadership models or the personal is political relate to gender-based violence or sexual violence? I think it's a very clear connection. It's again in that compounding echo of following youth leadership, following youth determinism, and understanding that they may have ideas around systems navigation that I have never thought of, and I can't shut that down if I haven't tried it, right? A lot of our work is trial and error methodology until we find pathways or can carve pathways in often hostile systems. So in 2019, the House of Commons released a report that pretty much validated a lot of our work in the sector and told us things that we already knew. But a piece that I want to share is that 2SLGBTQIA plus youth who had supportive environments that allowed them to be themselves thrived. And I think that a huge part of building those community networks is understanding that sexual and gender-based violence is a reality for so many youth, and creating and building space for those youth to have that conversation in a safer and care-based way, but also equipping them with the tools to support each other. So that often looks like having conversations around emotional boundary setting, having conversations around sexual health and bodily autonomy in ways that are 2S LGBTQIA plus centric. Often it's about having conversations around how to support a person who's disclosing. Those are incredibly important tools for young people to learn and to know, because they are disproportionately affected, and they need to have the skills to not only hold their experience and support their communities, but also be aware of how important those skills are, and how they should be prioritized as important elements of learning. And so I think some important concepts in creating safer spaces for 2S LGBTQIA plus youth are binarism and the gender binary. So I've already talked about this a little bit, the idea of good or bad or believable or unbelievable or worthy, unworthy. And we see this modeled in most of our institutions. And without getting too deep into this analysis, I truly believe that comes from a time when church and state were more clearly married, where a lot of our ideas around law came from the idea of moral or immoral based on the Catholic Church. And when we think about that in relationship to law now, and we think about that in relationship to the idea of perfect or constructed victimhood now, it is really terrifying, because we can really trace it to this idea of immorality. And I think 2S LGBTQIA plus populations and youth often and historically have to push back at the reality of being viewed in that way, or being viewed as deviant or different from. And I think that in those processes, it's so important to think about, where is this coming from? Where is this idea of moral or immoral coming from, and how do I counter it? How do I build a container or a safe space or an oasis for that conversation to not come up? How do I build spaces where that binarism is completely destructed? How do I build spaces where I teach and can offer conversations around duality and multiplicity to young people? There isn't ever just one answer. There is always a multiplicity in the ways in which we navigate not only our experiences, but others' experiences. So teaching that and offering spaces where that can be held, I think is a tool of harm reduction, and a tool that youth can use in navigating their own personal lived experiences, and potentially experiences that people that they love are navigating as well. And of course, the gender binary enforces the idea of that, the idea that there are two genders and they are opposite or static or fixed. And this shows up in almost all of our services that are institutions based. We see the ways in which there's such a lack of system competence in relationship to two-spirit, trans, and gender nonconforming care. And so our job as community workers is to acknowledge that, and to know that, and to learn that, and provide spaces where youth can process, where we advocate for the people that we're working alongside, where we learn the language so that we can offer that supportive space for those young people. And we can also hold the space of them just needing to talk about their experiences of potentially transphobia or trans misogyny, if they are choosing to navigate various systems that exist in our world. Another element that is important is gatekeeping. So the process by which individuals or subcommunities are excluded or policed by broader communities they belong to due to intersectional discrimination and respectability politics. In the medical space, this could look like the violent process in which trans and gender nonconforming patients are asked to prove their transness before being administered trans comprehensive care or trans competent care. And this also looks like the idea of who deserves believability, who deserves safety, who deserves understanding as a survivor. Gatekeeping exists again, a multiplicity. It exists in the context of our medical system in so many different routes that we sometimes do not acknowledge or understand unless we are faced with it. So when we think about our medical model, when we think about our legal model, it's really crucial to also do that reflective work and reflexive work of where is the gatekeeping happening? What kinds of identity are protected by these institutions, and why does that exist? And I think that the more that we can identify those elements of gatekeeping, we can then identify creative ways to work around that reality. The last piece that I'll share is essentialism or biological essentialism or determinism. And this is the belief that we are how we are based on our genetic makeup, including our race and our sex. So this often was used and is used to back up racism, transmisogyny, or transphobia within medical spaces. And also, I think, is a huge part of the construction of who we understand to be believable in relationship to sexual or gender-based violence, and who we feel compelled to support, to help, and to believe, and to uplift, and whose stories we want to center in those moments. So again, really important to think about these concepts and then find ways to identify them in our systems and then build those creative elements of holistic, comprehensive supports. So trauma-informed practice, we all have the capabilities to integrate a trauma-informed practice into our work. It is not something that is a specialty, it's not specialized. There are, of course, work that specifically really look at trauma-informed practice, and that is their practice in itself. But as community practitioners, if we hold a trauma-informed practice in a really simple way, that just means that we understand that youth and or whoever we're working have a variety of experiences, of stories that we may not know the depth of or the reality of, but we build room and we build a soft landing for them to share if they need to. And we assume that they are experiencing a variety of things that we don't see. So we build supportive systems or networks that can potentially catch some of that for those young folks or for whoever we're working alongside. Trauma-informed practice also means pushing away at binarism. It means, as Yvonne LaMarche writes in her incredible PhD project, Decolonizing Trauma Work, we have the capacity to deal with multiple realities as experiential learning moments, but also in the context of the world that we are experiencing. Renee Linklater also writes in a brilliant book, Decolonizing Trauma Work, Indigenous Stories and Strategies, which I absolutely recommend that everyone reads, and explores the direct link between colonization, trauma, and Indigenous knowledge systems, and gives tangible insights into working with individuals and communities that have experienced trauma. So understanding that sometimes in supporting a person who is disclosing an acute trauma that is very recent to them, that they are navigating, that might be a tip of the iceberg for intergenerational trauma that exists within their experience, that they might not have words to identify yet. And so part of a trauma-informed practice is also holding the reality that our generations, that our histories impact where we are currently and impact our capacity, our ability to navigate various institutions, and also, of course, impact our trust with those various systems. So it isn't necessarily a culturally relevant practice for me to assume that every person that I'm working with is going to want to ever access a medical model. So how do I then create something that is beneficial to them and to their experience? Trauma-informed practice also means that when we are navigating support systems, we have to understand that we might not be the right person for a young person or whoever you're working with to interact with. I think that shows up in my work a lot. Sometimes there are two-spirit, trans, or gender nonconforming youth who only want to talk to another trans or gender nonconforming or two-spirit person, and that is absolutely valid. So in those moments, sometimes there's a shuffle. Sometimes it isn't my job as executive director to have all of those conversations with youth because I'm doing all of the admin things, but I also find it really critical to then be that person if that young person needs me there. As a trans person, it's also really important if there is a youth who wants to talk to a racialized person person about their experience, that we shuffle, we think about who is in our organizations, we make sure that we have representative staff. And if we are not in a place where that exists yet, we have to have very fast and long-standing connection with other organizations so that we can utilize and share staff experience and expertise. It is incredibly valid for a young person, especially a 2SLGBTQIA+ youth who is experiencing multiple realities of oppression, to say, I want to talk to someone who reminds me of me. I want to see someone who is older than me who is surviving. And that is an incredible gift that we can offer, and we should not be limiting our service provision to who we have represented as staff only. We have to build larger networks, because I can guarantee that most people who are in positions of power in the local nonprofit sector all are pretty like homogeneous in experience, in at least my lived experience. And so what is it to build those networks with our community leaders, with our community, with more grassroots organizations, so we can have that representative experience. So there isn't just one racialized person or one racialized trans person or one disabled trans person holding all of those pieces at their organization because they are the only person who holds that experience, right? So there's an element here that also exists in strategy around who we have represented as a staff and who we have like mutual and caring and sustainable community relationships with and shared work practices with. So we're getting to the end, but I really just want to share quickly a really simple tool in anti-oppressive safety mapping. So this is something I do with my youth all the time. And these pieces here can totally be filled out in whatever way you would like. So often the youth's name goes in the middle, and depending on what we're thinking about or wanting to create, these pieces change. So if we're thinking about specifically direct safety, we are maybe putting here places that I feel safe that I can go to. And in that, there's a division between places that are open, like that are open during the day, places that are open at night. And then maybe there's a sub square that is specifically about places that they can sleep. So when we think about anti-oppressive safety mapping, we're holding our community networks, but we're also bringing in that young person supportive networks, and or finding ways to create links between various services they may be accessing. We might put people who are mentors and support people. So those are folks that maybe exist in community network spaces, their friends, their chosen family or biological family, and we put those people's phone numbers down. We put the boundaries or the kind of like limitations of contacting them. So maybe with some of their mentors, they can only contact them 9 to 5. Maybe with some of their friends are like, you can contact me until 2 a.m. And so we write that down and we hold it. And this safety mapping is really crucial because it also lets that young person tell you what they have access to instead of you assuming. And it also allows that young person to identify boundaries within their access use to support, and also identify the pieces that are missing, and also identify that there is so many ways to access support, and that often the person that you're working with knows a lot about what they need. They just need to be asked and given a tool to communicate that with you. Then we can put things like activation points, or like things that are triggering right now, and brainstorm that with that young person. Think about ways that they need to be communicated with. Think about specifically, for example, the community organizations they can access, or the support networks they can access. Think about what brings them joy. Have a little joy brainstorm. Where do you feel safe? Where do you feel seen? Where do you feel valued? That's just as important as thinking about, who can take your call in the middle of the night. It's about also cultivating that multiplicity and reality of, yes, you are in a process of healing. Yes, you are in a process of grief, potentially, maybe frustration, maybe anger. You're probably feeling a lot of things. But as we understand, marginalized communities have always had to navigate the duality of joy and grief, and joy and pain. And we shouldn't limit a young person's access to those things because we believe that grieving or mourning or processing or healing should look a certain way, right? So again, we can fill out any of these boxes in ways that are most relevant to our support practices and also the youth that we're working alongside. But I think really important elements are, of course, places that they can access, places that like to sleep, to be safer, that are outside of potentially a home space, people that they can access, mentors, support, of course, like their activation points or triggers right now, they're places of joy or aliveness, the places that they, like maybe their access needs, and also places, of course, that are giving them community support, so different organizations. And the last thing that I'll say is often our youth are in a political economy of waiting. 2SLGBTQIA+ populations are often in a temporality of having to wait for gender affirming care, or wait for justice, or wait for someone to believe them. And in our practice, sometimes that youth will come to us after years of waiting. And we have to, as a trauma-informed element of our work, understand that there is anger and frustration and hurt that comes with that, and understand it's not our fault, but understand that that may exist. And so in this political economy of waiting, how do we give youth autonomy? How do we understand that youth, often, because they've had so much time in their context of waiting, have thought about what they need? How do we cultivate that alongside them in a partnership, again, not as helper and helpee, but in mutuality and trust? And we've talked about this, but I think that the biggest piece is that we can't assume community. It's built, it's created and negotiated and preserved. And as Octavia Butler says so brilliantly, what do we imagine? What do we recreate? What do we invent? There is nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. So we create those new suns. We create the new worlds that we want to see alongside these incredible visionaries that we have the privilege and pleasure to work alongside. We create the new suns that hold better systems navigation. We create the new suns that hold holistic methodology of care. We create the new suns that hold tangible community-based justice. And so I'm gonna now stop sharing my screen and open it up for questions.
Carmel, thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about and some really practical tools that we can use in our work. You know, everything you said really resonated with me, and some points that I'm going to continue to reflect on or are your points around making space for young people and how that important that is. What you were saying in terms of creativity and imagination in changing our systems is so, so important, and reminds me of a book that I just finished called From What If to What Is, that actually talks about the importance of creativity and imagination in creating systems change. So I think that that's a really important point that we don't talk enough about. I also loved what you were saying when you were talking about morality and the law and how that particularly impacts survivors of gender-based violence and sexualized violence, particularly queer and trans survivors, and the importance of skill building in our education work with youth. So I want to thank you so much for all those important points and for the tools you gave. Like, I really loved the activity on reflecting on what we think and know about survivors. I love the anti-oppression safety mapping, and of course the reminders for community building. So if it's all right with you, I'm going to unmute Leslie, who has a question or comment, and allow them the space to talk. Okay, so Leslie, you should be able to speak now. I'm just going to unmute. You might have to unmute yourself. Okay, so I'm not sure. Leslie, if you unmute yourself, you can ask away, or you can put your question or comment in the chat box or Q&A. Other than that, I'll open space for Carmel to answer any questions. There's a lot of love and appreciation in the chat box for you and what you've shared so far. And yeah, I'm so grateful to be in this work with you. You're such a light, speaking of suns, in our community. So there's a question that says, I have a question about deconstructing gender binarism in spaces where we offer services. Do you have any notes on working with newcomer youth where gender binaries are often strong and reinforced by family and community?
I love this question, and I love this for a lot of reasons. One, I'm a second generation settler and immigrant from Iran, so I have that experience, I think, directly in my family and also in my personal practice. So I think that there's a few elements there. I think that we want to meet people where they're at. We are not here to have conversations where we catalyze conversations that folks are not ready for. So while we talk about unrooting gender binarism, another binary that we have to unroot is also thinking about the ways in which we disseminate information and thinking about, again, like how our cultural realities exist here, and thinking about that through a trauma-informed framework. So thinking about how that might affect a person who is potentially learning a new language, resettling, and finding their bearings in a new place. And so I think that there's elements where I would say meet that person where they're at. If they are looking for a specific space that is like specifically that they need, that is binaristic according to you, that's totally okay. That's the system that they need. That's the support system that they are looking for. If they are wanting to have a conversation around shifting their understanding and learning more, that's awesome. And to meet them there. I'm not sure if in this example that person is looking for a resource or if you are wanting to have a conversation with them. So I think that my answer varies depending. In the context of resource finding, meeting that person where they're at. Again, our personal politic cannot be brought into systems navigation work. A really important element of systems navigation work is that method of choice and autonomy. So even if personally I don't feel safe accessing, for example, a police service, I'm not going to tell a young person that they can't if that's feeling safe and important for them to do as part of their process. So that's an element there. I think in the context of navigating that conversation in a culturally relevant way, I think really accessible entry points that I've used in conversations with my own family and also conversations with incredible newcomer youth that I work alongside is finding ways that that conversation makes sense to them. So often when I'm talking to like my baba or my aunties, I'm asking them about their experiences of expectations around who they are based on their gender. And that's a really accessible entry point to have a larger conversation around, okay, what does that look like in the world? So often when we have that conversation with folks who have never had conversations around the expansiveness of the gender binary, we start at these accessible spaces. We start in what have you felt pressure to do or to be or to say because of your gender? Have you ever been told that you can't do something because of your gender? How does that feel? And I think that in that element of work and conversation, some really rich dialogue can emerge. And I've seen some really transformative conversations happen. Of course, conversations around then like transness and gender queerness and queerness all happen slowly and with patience and love and time, right? And it's important for us to also acknowledge that folks are going to come to that information when they do, and that like also as service providers, we are not the holders of like what is right and wrong, and we want to give resources and support folks in their learning, but we're not here to convince people of how to exist in the world. We're here to provide supportive elements of care and again allow determinism of choice and self-autonomy in those moments. But I love that question. Thank you so much for asking. Do folks have any other questions?
Thank you. So there was one question about the virtual resource room and whether that can be shared. And yes, absolutely, it can be shared at any time. I'll put the link in one more time and you can share that to anyone who may find it helpful. I particularly like the dog video. With that being said, I'll leave maybe one more minute for questions. And in the meantime, want to thank you again, Carmel. That was truly wonderful. And we're so lucky to be able to learn from and with you. Okay, well, I hope everyone who attended has a wonderful afternoon and gets to enjoy some of the spring sun. And we will have a recording of this up on our website in the next couple of days. Sorry, there is one last question. We have a few last minutes to answer it. And the question is, what do we feel about navigating duty to report while recognizing that institutions have gender and racial bias? That's a great question.
I love this question, and I'm really glad you asked it. So I think first, when thinking about, again, navigating client autonomy, often I'm really transparent about what the container of duty to report means to the folks that I'm working with. So I'll be really clear and say, hey, so before we start talking, here are the ways in which I can support you 100%. Here are my limitations, and here are also the limitations that exist within this field of practice. So if you share things that are pertaining to this, this means that I have to then do these things. And so then it allows for a young person or for whoever I'm working with to determine how they want to interact with that. Sometimes if you give youth that information, or if you give folks that information, they will actively not tell you the things that would then mean that you have to navigate duty to report because they don't, that like isn't safe for them. And so I think a huge part of systems rebuilding is, I think, transparency and equipping young folks with the information that they need to do to make decisions that are safest for them. So while as service providers, sometimes we feel like the safest option is to get somebody out of a situation, that might not be the safest option for that person who's in it and who's experiencing it on the day to day. And there are probably a million nuances wherein a young person has that lived experience, which is really determining their ability to navigate something different. And we don't know those elements. So I think that the biggest way that I navigate that is by talking about it openly with the young people that I'm working with. And then they are often really brilliant in navigating how they interact with me and what they tell me. And then there are moments where they tell me something and I have to report, and they know that. And that is in a conversation that we have together around what that looks like. And they are never excluded from that process. I would never navigate a process without their understanding and informing them, and also telling them and updating them about like next steps throughout that process. And so while sometimes there are systems that are not serving to us, there are creative ways to navigate, again, client autonomy through those moments, and make sure that they are communicated with and aware of changes, shifts, and pieces that might impact their day-to-day. Thank you so much for asking that question.
And thank you for that answer. I think that's so important, especially when we're talking about survivors of sexualized violence who, inherently have had their choice and agency taken away. Anytime we can give that back to people and supporting them is so important. One last logistical question is if, Carmel, you would be willing to share the slides with me so I can send them out to people who attended. I think especially the tools that you shared would be really helpful.
Totally. I will absolutely share those, Dee, and folks are welcome to utilize the slides in their places of learning. But I do ask if you are going to be teaching with any information from the slides, just to get in touch with me first. And I'll always say yes, but I just like to know when that's happening and make sure that it feels good for me. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me and for everyone being so attentive and thoughtful.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, everyone.